I'm very excited about this panel. We'll have a nice collection of remarks from folks from different areas of interest and expertise about open data and questions of ethics and privacy and security that will be moderated by the esteemed Dean of the Goldman School of Public Policy, Professor Henry Brady.
Sure. Sure. If you want to sit in the audience to watch the projector and stuff, that's great, guys, too. So, you know the story about somebody asked somebody to come to speak, and they sent a dean, and somebody called back later and said, we expected somebody lower than a dean. And the reply was, there is no one lower than a dean. So, I'm a dean. And there is no one lower than a dean. We've got a great panel. It's on transparency and its discontents. I just want to say that transparency is one of those topics. It's a little bit like the notion that maybe everybody should run around naked. And it would be great for a few people, but for most of us, it's really not a good idea. I speak for myself, certainly. So I do worry that sometimes transparency has become a phrase of, gee, everything should be transparent, and it's not clear to me that's going to make necessarily for a better world. So I hope our panelists do talk a little bit about what the limits of transparency are, and that's what the discontents maybe gets at. So we have a great panel. Megan, are you first?
Yeah.
So Megan Finn is our first speaker. She's a postdoc researcher at Microsoft Research, and among other things, she does crisis informatics, which I just think sounds fascinating. So I'll introduce each one as we get there. So Megan, please.
Hi, my name is Megan. As the introduction said, I do work in crisis informatics from an information science program. I'm actually not going to be talking about that today. I'm going to be drawing more on my experience doing historical research. So in the brief time I have today, I'm going to walk through an overview of how I'm thinking about some of the questions we've been talking about today, why making data is on the screen, and I think it's an interesting entrance point to talk about a number of the different issues that this panel is sort of trying to deal with, thinking about privacy, equity, and access. And I'm going to walk through a historical example talking about the census in 1890 and 1900 in San Francisco. So in a sense, digital network methods of data circulation and storage are really why we're all here talking about government today. However, as we all know, and it has come up many, many, many times today, that the government makes information about itself and about its population and about the land that it governs is much, much, much older. And Paul Duguid, who's a professor here at the School of Information, has a nice paper about how the original statutes of California, a huge number of the acts are actually sort of information-making, record-keeping acts. So talking about public archives, marks and brands, state recorder's office, translator, printer. So this is all these are long, long processes. These are long practices of data making and record keeping that have been institutionalized over a hugely long period of time, since literally the founding of California in the case of the state. And so these practices have been institutionalized in particular contexts with particular audiences in mind and in particular materialities that people are working with. And so when we start to talk about new methods of circulation and new methods of storage and new methods of getting the data out there, this sort of open data over the internet, my argument is that you have to rethink this sort of entire workflow of data making. And so this is my sort of attempt of thinking through what the workflow for data making is. And I think sort of the first panels of the day really talked about circulating data. The last panel did an amazing job talking through a lot of the really complicated issues in processing data, and Jay Costa's talk in particular, like really walking through what it means to process a lot of this data, I thought really, elevated that complexity. And I really want to focus on this idea of making data. So as an example of thinking about the changing workflow, and again, sort of Zach Bookman and Maury Blackman talked about this earlier today. If we think about something like the daily treasury yield curve, this is kind of a nice example of open data. It's available in a couple of different XML formats. There's an FAQ explaining how this number was generated. But really, this is just sort of an endpoint, and what's published on the website is not really representative of the whole workflow. Many, many people have been circulating Excel spreadsheets attached to emails, working really, really hard at coming up with this number. But again, the sort of the open data that we see is not really representative of the entire workflow. And rethinking the workflow is not just a matter of thinking through the tools involved in making data, like are you sending around Excel attachments or are you circulating XML files on the web? Rethinking workflow is also acknowledging the really complex relations between people who are making data and what they're doing with it. So there's a nice paper by someone named Alon Preled called When Transparency and Collaboration Collide that looks at the first couple years of data.gov. And he really explores, well, his team comes up with this interesting finding, which is that over 90% of the data sets on data.gov, and I think this was in 2011, were contributed by 5 agencies, and there's like over 170 different agencies. And so his team is sitting back and they're saying, well, why is this? And what they found was that that the data sets are really a source of power for these different agencies. They're able to use them to trade, for money and favors amongst the different agencies. Additionally, it created problems for them if they put up incomplete data or bad data. Once it's out there, it's like how do you fix it? And the mechanisms for that aren't really clear at this point. So the team found that most agencies were doing the sort of performance of openness. They were putting stuff out there, but in fact, it wasn't actually open in sort of the spirit of a lot of the laws that were passed. So I want to come at this fascinating topic of open government data from this angle of making data. And there are 3 reasons why I think this is really interesting. So first is, as I said, I think when you talk about new methods of circulating data, you need to think about remaking the whole workflow. How are we making data for this open circulation? The second is, I think, in academia and other circles, oftentimes the really hard work of making high-quality data is really not accounted for. And so I want to highlight the difficulty of that work. Then the last reason is this panel is dealing with issues around privacy and access and equity. And I think talking about this making interventions at the site where people are making data is potentially an interesting place to talk about this. So the 1890 census in San Francisco was regarded sort of in the public sphere as an absolute disaster. People thought that the census would reveal that 300,000 to 325,000 people lived in San Francisco. Instead, the numbers came in and they were much closer to 298,000, and people were like furious. And so there was a lot of speculation as to why these numbers were lower than what people thought they were going to be. So there were a lot of different reasons circulating. So one was that boarding houses, which like SROs now, were largely ignored. That there was a large homeless population in San Francisco that just wasn't counted. The census was taken in the month of June, which was both a time when wealthy and laborers were out of town, either working or on holiday. And often the work of the enumerators was really blamed. People speculated that they weren't paid enough. The enumerators were actually paid per person that was on their census schedule. So there was one case of an enumerator who padded his census schedule with the names of 375 baseball players, and he was arrested. There was complaints this new census had a lot more questions than in 1880, that they took a really long time to answer. People accused the enumerators of being careless and lazy. On one hand, they were accused of padding districts. On the other hand, they were accused of undercounting. And so it was a very, very contentious census. And San Francisco was not the only place that people were having problems. There's a great story about Minneapolis and St. Paul. The businessmen of St. Paul ended up bringing a lawsuit against the businessmen of Minneapolis, accusing them of padding the census with 1,100 people, and because everybody was really invested in the story of growth. And people knew that the data told stories about their town. The data was created in an environment of competition and also collaboration, but certainly in an environment of competition. So there were incentives in place to really manipulate these numbers. 1890 is also notable because it was the first year that the US Census was tabulated with the Hollerith machine, with a mechanical device. And so people not only blamed, when the US Census numbers came back, they were also lower than people thought they were, and they didn't really conform to the story of U.S. as the fastest growing country in the world. So 62 million instead of 75 million people were counted. And so people not only blamed the enumerators, they blamed the machines that were used to count the number of people. So when the 1900 census rolled around, people were determined to count every single San Franciscan. A guy named Carl Coppling-Plen, who was a professor here at Berkeley in the Commerce Department, was head of the census, and he got out in front of the media and said, we are going to count every single person. He says, if we have to, we're going to place every person, every enumerator is going to sit in front of boarding houses and wait for every person to come back. We don't care if they're trying to dodge the census. We'll bring the police in if necessary. The 1900 census was also very complicated because Chinatown was under quarantine at this time because there was an outbreak of the plague. The quarantine was actually later thrown out in court because it was ruled racist. But it created another set of problems for the enumerators who had to be inoculated to go in and do the census. And Plen pointed out, on the downside, everybody in Chinatown is very, very angry at officials and not really wanted to talk to them. But the upside is that everybody is trapped there, and so they should be easier to count. So why am I going on about this historical example? I think sometimes it's easier to look at the past to see some of the interesting problems of working with data. But so I have a couple different lessons. First, making data that meets the quality standards that people want is very, very difficult. While data sets are quite valued, and I think a lot of the different talks today have talked about how valuable these data sets are, the labor that goes into making the data sets is often not valued. There's a lot of cultural work embedded in data collection and data practices that can be very, very hard to see, but can be very, very crucial for interpreting data sets. Data is made in an environment of competition and collaboration and needs to be treated as such when being interpreted. And again, the context for data collection is not often expressed. So how can we use this to reconsider these questions about privacy, equity, and access? So Census is mandated in our Constitution, but most other government data programs and collection programs are not. And I think it's important in our sort of post-Snowden NSA era to think about what does it mean? Can people opt out of being made into data? When do people get to opt out? What does that mean? Is it enforceable in any way? So I think that's one really important question to talk about. Second, and there's been a lot of interesting discussion about different ways of doing this today. Carol Post in the morning talking about New York had some interesting ideas about getting the community better together to really be able to work on these open data programs in New York. Dr. Gerstein, who's going to talk soon, have noted giving people the opportunity to talk back to these data sets is important, but it doesn't always happen. And sort of what are the mechanisms for doing that? And my last sort of point is the data we're talking a lot about open data, but the process of making the data is often not as open to some degree. Talking about what gets represented in the data set and how to talk about that are old problems that the information management and archiving community have been dealing with for a long, long time. What are the relationship between different data sets? And what do people need to know about the data in order to find it? This is sort of a classic information science problem of discoverability. But also, what do people need to know in order to interpret the data that's in a way that's faithful to its original representation? So, thanks.